quickly invite Salome for the talk, and we will, if at the end of each presentation, I'll ask if you have a burning question that you cannot wait at the end for the Q&A session. If not, if your question should be asked and should be responded immediately, feel free to raise your hand, or at the end we will have a Q&A session. Thank you. Oh, okay. So he's coming actually. Okay. Oh, no? Hocam biz başladık.
Can everyone hear me? That sounds like it's working. All right, so my name is Salome Fayoun, and I'm a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University working on privacy and cybersecurity. And I'm here to talk to you all about the Internet of Things and its implications for privacy and surveillance. So we had excellent discussions earlier today and yesterday about the significant security risks that these devices pose. I'm more interested in taking a step back to do a more general review of what they mean for our privacy and the relationship between surveillance between these devices and us conditioned by surveillance, with a few reflections in the hope of sparking a good conversation. So what is the Internet of Things? So there are interesting academic discussions of this, but to get a sense of how the term operates in the public imagination, I turned to our favorite arbiter of truth, Google, and just Google image searched for sort of a popular image of what the Internet of Things is. And so you see here a number of devices that I think would commonly be referred to as smart devices: a smart thermostat, smart watch, a smart home. As previously mentioned, smart is mostly a branding term, but it refers generally to not to things connected to the internet, but computers connected to the internet that happen to do things. As Bruce Schneier says, your oven is a computer that makes things hot. Your refrigerator is a computer that keeps things cold. An ATM is a computer with money inside. Your car used to be a mechanical device with some computers in it, and now it's a 20 to 40 computer distributed system with 4 wheels and an engine. And soon we'll see more things that are not really things, but computers that happen to do things, including pacemakers, insulin pumps, and even pills. And it's not just you and your home. Cities are becoming smart. So with sensors embedded in roads, streetlights, sidewalks, and energy infrastructure, all used to measure traffic flow, weather, population flows, energy, with the goal of optimizing things like energy use, regulating traffic, speeding up police and medical response times, automatically reporting road flooding or accidents, all with the goal of improving public services. So when I Google the idea of surveillance, I also get an interesting sense of our public notion of what surveillance is. It's eyes and cameras, governments and companies, specifically technology companies. And there's a sense of pervasiveness in this image or set of images, and also dislike. My definition of surveillance, which is pretty similar to the Wikipedia definition, is that surveillance is the monitoring of behavior, activities, or other changing information for the purpose of influencing, managing, directing, or protecting people. So how do these two ideas, the Internet of Things and surveillance, fit together? Well, they fit together in this notion that I call ambient surveillance. The Internet of Everything creates a world of ambient surveillance. And this world represents a fundamental shift in the scale and scope of connection. So to illustrate my point, here is a picture of Goodwin Hall at the US University Virginia Tech. As of its completion in 2004, it was the most connected building. The school newspaper wrote at the time, "Goodwin Hall knows where you are." The newly built engineering building is rigged with 241 accelerometers that measure motion and vibration inside and outside its walls. The building is the world's most instrumented for the measurement of vibration, and it contains 3 times as many sensors as the world's next most measured building. I think the image of Goodwin Hall really encapsulates this idea of ambient surveillance, because it sort of is a space where you no longer go to a specific site to be online. You simply are online. more or less constantly, and the internet permeates the physical experience we have in the world. And in a way, we're already there. As of 2017, 8.4 billion things were attached to the internet. Those are mostly computers and phones. But by 2020, estimates are that somewhere between 20 and 75 billion objects will be connected to the internet. This leads to a world defined by a single global internet that senses, thinks, and acts. As Julie Cohen puts it, we're moving from a world of connected networks to sensing networks, architected to enable the continued and structured flow of data. And how has this move been sold to us? As consumers, I think the idea of this sensing network, living in a sensed network world, is sold as the promise of personalization. Objects tailored to your individual preference. So a smart refrigerator can learn your shopping habits and suggest new recipes, or let you know when your grapes are going bad. A smart TV can sense your mood and suggest TV shows accordingly. For governments, this idea is sold as the promise of efficiency. That smart cities are about giving municipal governments the information they need to target limited resources more effectively and optimally. And to employers, this idea of smart is the promise of increased employee control, increased productivity, and cost savings. So in the US, where employers mostly are the predominant providers of health insurance, many give workers fitness trackers to lower insurance premiums. But a world of ambient surveillance may promise more nefarious forms of worker surveillance as well. In 2017, the National Labor Review Board held that an employer's video surveillance of employees distributing union literature was illegal and constituted an unfair labor practice. These protections apply clearly to union activity in many countries. But while employers are forbidden from monitoring union activity, IoT devices like Fitbits or driving apps that Uber and Lyft use can monitor what we call proto-unionizing activity by tracking workers when they're congregating together at work or after hours. And the legality of this type of monitoring has not been tested. So in exchange for the promises that we are given by the world of ambient surveillance, what do the makers of smart devices get in return? Well, data is a valuable asset. And by embedding proprietary intermediaries, companies extract and enclose this asset to create de facto, if not de jure, proprietary relations to data. Government and corporate analytical capabilities via the Internet of Everything drive further data collection on which to make even better targeted insights. This leads to what I call the data imperative, by which data collectors are engaged in positive feedback loops of data collection. So new analytical methods expand the need for further data collection, and IoT furthers that collection via new innovative ways of extracting seamless data flows. This creates an extension of the world Zeynep Tufekci describes in her post-Cambridge Analytica critique of Facebook, when she noted that, while not a breach, the Cambridge Analytica scandal was something even more troubling, an all-too-natural consequence of Facebook's business model, which involves having people go to the site for social interaction only to be quietly subjected to an enormous level of surveillance. Under ambient surveillance, you don't even have to go to the site. The surveillance simply exists all around you as you drive, walk, make toast, and turn your lights on. So as we move from communication networks to sensing networks, there are two implications that I would like to highlight. First, as we extend our existing trends, we extend the existing trends that we're seeing already online. The shift from what can be known about our digital selves in digital space into what can be known about our physical selves in physical space. As this occurs, the scope and magnitude of harm we can experience is dramatically expanded. So now that everything, in other words, now that everything is a computer, the exploitation and threats that occur on computers become the exploitation or threats on life or property. Second, when information is being picked up about us in this ambient, seamless way, we further naturalize and render even more invisible the process of data extraction. This mythologizes the exchange of data extraction for personalization and efficiency as the essential relation between our technologies and ourselves. And this may foreclose other possibilities or a broader political reimagination around what sort of relationship we can have with our technologies. It's important to remember that IoT surveillance or ambient surveillance is a man-made phenomenon. This hyper-surveillant internet is not what we originally sort of had online. The early internet was not built on data extraction. and early online communities had neither the desire nor the capability to make surveillance synonymous with online life. I also think it's interesting to pause here and think about the term smart. Bruce Schneier, again, says, smart is the prefix we use for newly computerized things that are on the internet, meaning that they can collect, use, and communicate data to operate. An item is smart when it constantly collects data about you and your habits. I think it's worth pausing here and asking, smart for what and smart for who? We are increasingly seeing demands for expanded democratic participation, not simply in how our data is collected or what data is collected, but the question of why. To what ends do we want to devote data-driven decision-making, and in what context do we trust these types of decisions? So, uncharacteristically, I will leave you with a few bright notes on the horizon regarding substantive debates behind this notion of smart. First, you are seeing an increased trend of employee-driven campaigns at technology companies. And here I want to highlight one at Amazon regarding their facial recognition technology. So employees at Amazon were calling on Jeff Bezos to end the sale of facial recognition camera technologies to law enforcement agencies and to discontinue partnerships with any companies that worked with the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. An employee letter notes, we don't have to wait to find out how these technologies will be used. We already know that in the midst of historic militarization of police, renewed targeting of black activists, and the growth of a federal deportation force currently engaged in human rights abuses, this will be another powerful tool for the surveillance state and ultimately serve to harm the most marginalized. That was in a letter from employees to Jeff Bezos at Amazon. In the government context, you're seeing an increase in local surveillance ordinances. And these sorts of ordinances have already been passed in Seattle, Oakland, San Jose, Davis, and they're soon going to be passed in Cambridge and Boston as well. These local surveillance ordinances provide proactive hearings and community oversight in the purchase and implementation of surveillance technologies. They're meant to restore community control, not at the back end of surveillance in the form of transparency reporting, but at the front end, in reviewing and balancing community goals like privacy against the government interests in the acquisition and use of surveillance technologies. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Salome. Do we have any burning questions for her? Or do you like to wait for the end? I believe so. Perfect. So it is Aslı's turn. Thank you.
Hello, it's Aslı Helvacıoğlu from Boğaziçi University. I'm the director of the Innovation Center that is actually working on innovation management policies and strategies. So today I don't want to talk about the diminishing boundaries of privacy and the personal data. Today everybody knows that loneliness is an epidemic. We all know it. But also to be left alone is a right. That right we attain to our own privacy zones. Privacy in legal terms is a naturalistic concept, which comes from the divine human right relation that is totally dedicated to one's own being and the right to be by itself, by oneself, and being what he or she desires to be. And then we have our own privacy zones. Legally, you can define the privacy zone within certain aspects. I mean, you can define the zone where you live as a part of your house, within your marriage, within your relations with your children and relatives. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind that everywhere you go, your privacy zone is something that you carry with you. I sometimes think that it's like the bubbles. Of course, not dreaming of the unicorns as well, but in a way that we're carrying out our privacy bubbles with us. And every time we interact with other people, with other technologies, we come to appear and come to this mind that we certainly become a part of the privacy zone of the other person. And then we have this loneliness. Okay, we hate being lonely, okay? We all do. We are social animals at the end. But at the same time, we are becoming too much dependent on the technologies that never let us alone. So what would be the limit of keeping a legal term or creating a legal framework for the privacy zone still keeping the data protection effective, functional, and enforcing the data owner. The data economy that we live in today is a part of the innovation culture. Look, in politics, in economy, in social sciences, something that we're really afraid of, that really scares us, is uncertainty. We want to be sure of things. We like stability. We always dream of getting an economic stability, don't we? We always think about being something stable that stands there, that comforts us. There's a part of the comfort zone we have. But you know what? In innovation, we hate stability. The urge for the innovation itself is not what we have in our hands that really comforts us, but is totally what we lack. So innovation derives from dystopia, okay? So in such a case, we have to keep the innovative capacity and the capability of each single actor in the society alive, and we want to keep that trigger as long as possible in a sustainable manner. So there comes to this very important and a very crucial point. How I'm going to make laws for privacy and personal data, keep the innovation in hand and continue it in a sustainable manner, but at the same time also create a barrier for the emerging technologies for not to abuse my personal data. I think this is one of the most important choices, the preferences that both policymakers and lawmakers make. From my point of view, I think data is becoming a part of a universal utility. Hyper-connected societies, hyper-connected cities, everything is smart, but we need to make people as smart as the machines. So there are two ways to approach that problem. One is just creating well-designed, holistic legal programs that would define and also create solutions for every single conflict that may appear throughout the time. I think GDPR is very much in line with this. Okay. Have you ever read GDPR? I mean, it's millions of pages. And I think it's going to be millions more because that is the routine of EU. Okay, I have a PhD on EU law, so I know how they like to make new laws, okay? Not because that it needs, but also you need a concerted, harmonized practice within all of these different states. So the second routine would be just observing what is going on in technology and innovation. Look, I am moving from a very naturalistic part of law, which derives from privacy, human rights, a divine right provided to human beings, from a very positivist, a very evidence-based lawmaking capacity related with the complications that not only appear at this time, but that may also have the potential to appear throughout the development of the innovative capacity of the technology. Therefore, the more evidence-based lawmaking capacities I depend on, then it means that I need more data. I need to observe, I need to keep the recording, I need to process. I'm just becoming a part of that. And in my mind, when I'm just dealing with this diminishing boundaries, I have something else to say about it, that every single act that I take, every single decision that I make, whatever I do, at the end, I am producing data, okay? And is it possible for me to figure out what is going on with my data every single time that I produce it? It's a great awareness that even I think the law scholars, you don't have it. I mean, it's because the technology don't let us. So one way is to empower the technology itself by privacy by design solutions, okay? So you let the technology to keep up for you and control you and somehow share your legal responsibility on your own data. But, however, by this way, you should be creating a real trust relationship between the ones that build up the technology and embed the control mechanisms in that technology and the ones that you're using. The second part of that would be very much related with this granular data that you produce every day, the data economy, which is, again, as I said, it's becoming a utility day by day. And not to empower the technology as well, but to empower the data owner. And the major problem here is, of course, the systematic power asymmetry that is driving from the capitalism itself. We have countries that have the potential of having innovative economies. We have the innovative-led and highly innovative countries, developed countries, and you cannot expect every single state to have the same legal capacity to enact the essential legal order to control the emerging technologies against the privacy zone and to protect the people. So what I believe is that there should be a new innovative data culture, which would be ending up in a concerted practice in an international system. Here, as a part of the data, we also should acknowledge and empower the data owner by law to decide the limits of the processing or to decide whether to let opt-in or opt-out in the systems. This is something we do now, but we are really dealing a little part of the technology as of today. I mean, 10 years later, most probably, we would be having small smart contracts being embedded in every single technology that we use. And this would lead to a new chapter in law, which would be dealing with the monetization of your data. You would be earning money from the data that you have. In the United States, it's much more common because we know that there are some potential agencies, intermediaries that are running the medical contracts for the use of the data. So maybe we're going to have lots of new intermediaries. I mean, it's a certain point of view. So I want to go back to that privacy zone again. So in my privacy zone, I want to live free and happy. That is one of the most important responsibilities of the welfare state. And this is one of the most important commitments that is being made for the citizenship. But at the same time, the point that I migrate from the real traditional conventional life to that virtual environment, something happens. That commitment of my own welfare state turns out to be a need for a commitment for all of the parties being involved in that virtual environment. So this also provides, I think, the legal basis for further legislating the data as a part of a universal service and as a part of the global legislation. It is needed for interoperability. It is needed for a mutual understanding of the concepts. It is needed efficiently for defining the new technologies, because if you do not have the same definition for the new technology, how can you regulate it? There will be a kind of a mess. We have seen it at blockchain, okay? How do you want to see the blockchain? Okay, is it only related with the currency as a digital currency, or is it only kind of an intermediary platform which can evolve into something new but keeping the first implication of being a distributed ledger? So in certain cases, I want to think about, and I just want to dream about, a new, very innovative legal discourse, Where for the new technologies, I don't even talk about artificial intelligence or virtual reality, where the legal liability of the parties would be defined totally different from what you are in your life and what you are really in your virtual life and the implications of that. So as a part of it, we have to keep in mind that for emerging technologies, there are 3 last words that I want to say. I think I have 1 or 2 minutes, I guess. Okay. I think there are 3 important things which I want to mention. The first one is, of course, is not to make laws for technologies, but make laws for the innovative environment, keep the environment as flourishing and keeping the rights and the obligations of the actors within steps. So we are designing an ecosystem. Secondly, make laws that have global approach, global enforcement capacity, and the mutual understanding of the conceptual base. And thirdly and lastly, use that as an ability to empower the society and create a much more efficient welfare, which is dedicated to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Asli. Before we are moving to Stefan, do we have any questions for her? Okay, so we wait for the end. Thank you. While Stefan is moving towards the stage, I really enjoyed your relationship between privacy bubbles and loneliness. I guess that's some sort of, food for thought for all of us.
Great, wonderful. So my name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder and chief of research and development of the GovLab, which is based in New York at New York University. And so the GovLab is an action research center, and we focus on how can we change the way we govern using new technologies. And specifically, we focus on 2 important assets that technology has allowed us to leverage for improving the way we make decisions, or the way we go about designing public services, or the way we go about solving public problems. And those 2 assets that we specifically focus on are, on the one hand, data, surprise, surprise, which is probably why I'm here, and the other one is people. And so we do a lot of work on collective intelligence, but we also do a lot of work on artificial intelligence. And I'm going to focus on one line of activity within GovLab, which relates with what we try to advocate for, relates with a new concept of data responsibility. And I think we do need to move the data privacy debate quite often into a data responsibility debate, where we really try to go beyond just privacy or security, but also other risks, but also other responsibilities that we need to take into account when we look into the concept of data and using data. And I'm going to start with an example. And the example relates to what happened in Nepal in 2015. As some of you might know, in April 2015, Nepal got hit by one of the worst earthquakes that Nepal had ever encountered. And it basically put the whole country down. It created immense devastation. Many historical buildings disappeared forever. And on top of that, of course, a huge amount of injuries, both people dying and also people injured from the earthquake. And so what happened then was interesting, because it was a reflection of a new kind of data responsibility that I think we as a community caring about privacy also have to take into account, because it creates also tensions in how we think about privacy and protecting data. And so what happened next was that Ncell, the largest mobile phone operator in Nepal, decided to actually opening up its data and share it with Flowminder, which is an NGO based both in Sweden and in the UK, shared it with Flowminder in order to extract insights from call detail records to then support the emergency relief operation that was active in Nepal following the earthquake. And so what happened was that they provided real-time data, real-time maps on how the population was moving around following the earthquake and really indicated that everyone was actually leaving Kathmandu, and so that you shouldn't actually centralize all your efforts to actually providing services in Kathmandu. And so that led to many more lives being saved and many more people being prevented from injuries. And it also reflects or shows to a large extent a new kind of public-private partnership between, on the one hand, the data holder, and especially the private data holder, in this case the telecom operator, and a public-minded NGO or public emergency operations. And this new kind of public-private partnerships is something that we have been focusing on a lot at the GovLab, and we have termed the emergent practice of private data for good data collaboratives, because this is not just about, and quite often it doesn't even involve opening up data. It's really about working together with the public sector, including researchers, but also quite often city officials, for instance, around extracting insights from data collected by the private sector to improve people's lives. And so those data collaboratives, to a large extent, create new tensions in the data privacy environment, because it is a new kind of responsibility, which is about what's the responsibility to actually share data in addition to protect the data. And so in our project on data collaboratives, we basically try to map current examples. And so we have a repository which is called the Data Collaboratives Explorer, which we update on a weekly basis. And at the moment we have more than 100 examples where corporations have shared or collaborated with the public sector around extracting insights that can help improve people's lives. And so based upon those 100 examples that we have analyzed into detail, we basically came to the conclusion, of course, that there is no one way of doing that. We have now a taxonomy of data collaboratives, ranging from data pools, for instance, cooperatives, where actually data is being shared in a pool environment, to, for instance, not sharing anything, but only sharing insights, which is in itself a valuable contribution, to, of course, perhaps for some researchers, the nirvana of having access to data through an API. And of course, each type of data collaboratives has different risks, but also different value propositions that brings to its that brings with it in itself. And so we and I have especially tried to write something about this new kind of data responsibility, where not only there is a duty to protect perhaps, but there might also be some kind of a duty to actually share or collaborate around that data when there is a clear value proposition that if you would actually engage around the data, you could improve people's lives in a substantial manner through a variety of ways. And then the other aspect of data responsibility is not only creating insight that can help people's lives, but also making sure that actually those that can act upon the insights then also act. Because the amount of prototyping, the amount of pilots in the data for good environment that doesn't lead to anything is astounding. And quite often it's because there is no pipeline following the insight to actually then translate the insight into action that can improve people's lives, such as, for instance, improving transportation within a city once you have actually insight on how your city operates. And so, towards that end, we developed a framework of data responsibility where there are different steps, and I'm not going to go through all the steps towards data responsibility in the context of data collaboration. But one step, which by the way is which was from my point of view astounding that it didn't exist, but one step is actually, and that's the step that is the first one before you start engaging, is being able to identify the value you seek to generate when you collaborate with the public sector. And so just expressing the value proposition or the benefit you would like to establish, and then subsequently what is the problem you want to solve, and then related to that, what's the question you seek to answer with the data, that in itself from my point of view, is a privacy-preserving action, because if you don't know what the benefit is, or you don't know what the question is you seek to answer, you might actually touch data that you shouldn't touch, or touch data that you shouldn't have access to in the first place. And so based upon our value assessment, we can actually already anticipate what's the minimum data set that you need to have. And so one of the terms I quite often use within our work is the minimum viable data set that is necessary to answer the question, which, by the way, is a privacy-preserving action that most people ignore as an action to establish. And so this is our value assessment, very rudimentary. Of course, each step has then more detail. But we identify 4 types of societal benefits that you could consider, ranging from improving governance, and so this is not just government, but the way we go about making decisions, to the way we design public services, empowering individuals, making individuals capable of making better decisions on what hospitals to go to, for instance, or what route to follow. Solving public problems by making us more aware of what the problem really is, as opposed to just focusing on symptoms, for instance, and then also creating economic opportunities beyond the single unit of a corporation, so that you can actually also, for instance, provide access to data for small and medium-sized enterprises that now can also flourish as a result. So these are largely the 4 public value buckets that we have identified. And then the question is, of course, how can you provide the value? And basically there are only, well, there are more, but there are 4 types of extracting value from data that can serve public value. One is just becoming smarter about the situation, so pure situational awareness. Second one is actually developing insight on correlations and connections and causalities. So you not only become smarter about reality, you also try to explain reality. And then the third one is then about predicting how might actually the problem evolve over time, and then ultimately impact assessment. And it's important to be able to express in which category you try to create value, because it has implications for the type of data and the granularity of data you actually want to have access. Now, following the value assessment, you obviously want to do a risk assessment as well. And so here, I'm not going to go into detail because several have already introduced the life cycle approach to risk assessment, which I think, by the way, is a very important approach to really start understanding how, for instance, privacy principles or even privacy legislation can and should be considered, because there are different risks at different parts of the life cycle, at the collection stage, at the processing stage, at the sharing and analyzing stage, and then ultimately also risks at actually the using stage, which might mean that if there is a substantial risk that the information or the insight could be used against the ones you hope to help, then you might not even want to engage with, for instance, the public sector on disclosing that information. And so once you've done that risk assessment, you have a better sense on how you could go about creating the value. Now, one element that I do want to say is that if you do this kind of risk assessment for data collaboratives at the collection stage, for instance, it's interesting to see is that there is not only a risk involved with those that are in the data, there is also a risk involved with those that are not in the data. Meaning, if you are using, for instance, cold detail records, and you have a certain category, what we call data invisibles, meaning people that are not included in the data, and you start to decide on how to actually allocate resources based upon that data that is not representative, because there are certain individuals, and quite often group of individuals, not included in the data, then you have a risk to those that are not included in the data. And so you have a whole new layer of risk that goes beyond protecting those that are in the data. And so I think it creates new insights with regard to how we go about data responsibilities. Now, is this easy? It is obviously not easy. And so we have, through our own practice, because we have a set of our own data collaboratives that we have established, accessing, for instance, cold detail records in Santiago de Chile, or search data in India, the realization is that there are a huge amount of transaction costs involved in actually getting this off the ground with corporations. And part of the transaction cost is that corporations are not organized to think about their data in terms of creating public value beyond creating efficiencies for their own corporation. And so we have basically called for a new kind of profession, which we call the data stewards within corporations, which are not just people that care about protecting the data, but are also people that care about leveraging the data for doing good in society. And it requires a new kind of basically skill set that we, anyway, focus on the three kinds of buckets, ranging from establishing partnerships with those that could actually act upon the data when there is new insights generated, and that can lead to improvement of people's lives, to ultimately, of course, the protection of individuals, both those that are in the data and those that might not be in the data, and then ultimately ensuring that there is an action following the insight that is being generated. And so we have now identified several functions. We are working with a whole range of corporations on actually professionalizing this function, because this is really emerging practice. And if we cannot professionalize, for instance, we cannot transparent indicate on what solicitations for using the data will be considered and under what criteria, you will actually have distrust in the practice of data stewardship. If you can say, well, those researchers can have access, or we will work with those, but not those, and there is no policy that can be shared what the criteria are on how you're going to review solicitation for data, then ultimately you will create, of course, distrust. And likewise, if you as a corporation say, well, these are the problems, given our mission, that we would like to help seek address, then of course you are missing perhaps a opportunity to also express some corporate social responsibility as it relates to your data, which is really what is necessary. Now, let me end by some two considerations to add to the complexity that already was introduced through the variety of panels, which have, I think this conference was excellent, not only in learning the principles and some of the practices, but it was also excellent to indicate that there are a lot of tensions involved in all the kinds of provisions that currently exist, tensions with regard to how do you actually implement it. But the first tension is also, which I want to introduce, is that what is actually the ethics and risk of not engaging around your data. There's a lot of focus on preventing harm, but preventing harm could also be harmful if you don't think this through well, right? So what is the risk of actually not collaborating? And the second consideration that I want to add is that if you then engage with corporations, what are then the dependencies, the political economy that you should be aware of? For instance, we do a lot of work with statistical agencies, and we try to have statistical agencies innovate in the big data era. And part of that is to have statistical agencies work with corporations around their data so that they can come up with new metrics, for instance, metrics of economic well-being, or new ways of actually leveraging data that is more real-time than the traditional statistical methods. Now, the challenge here is, of course, if you create new dependencies on availability of data, then ultimately you might have a political economy that could be tricky and could actually, from a statistical agency point of view, be harmful down the line if you actually have people relying on those insights as well. And that's just one example. There are numerous examples that we need to be more aware of, but these are some considerations I just leave here because I think these are worthwhile to add to the already existing tensions that we have seen throughout the conference. With that, Murat, I'm going to stop here.
Okay, perfect, thank you. I can already start hearing the debates in enterprises on people between that would basically go for data responsibility against, we have to protect our data because it's our commercial interest, people. So that's going to be interesting. Do you have any burning questions for Stefan? Oh, is there? Okay, you need a microphone.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, you all. Claudio Lucena again from Paraíba State. I've taken a look at the project already because it's a very interesting resource, and I've seen that among the many partnerships you have, there's a collaboration between Facebook, OECD, and the World Bank for future of business. So the quick question is, how is it more difficult? There are some platforms that depend much more, the core business depends on data, and it's slightly different from negotiating the sharing of data with the public sector, whose business must be to share data. So I would like you to talk a little bit about negotiating this sharing of data between public sectors, whose natural trend is to share data, and with companies whose core business depend on this data.
Yeah, no, very good question. And well, first of all, you could challenge whether the public sector naturally shares its data. That's another project we've been working on. But yeah, clearly there are different incentives from the different partners involved. And quite often even within the corporations, like with Facebook, for instance, Facebook would even argue that they are in a different position than, for instance, satellite corporations, because satellite corporations have a business related with the data that they collect. Facebook claims they have no business related with the data that they collect. They're not monetizing the data they collect as opposed to satellite operations, for instance. And so that's already, anyway, just to show that the complexity of the different types of corporations, but there are clear different incentives, and that's what we are working on, is how do you establish those data sharing agreements to maximize the benefits to society, but also to ensure that the incentives for the public and the private sector are somewhat aligned. As it relates to the incentives of the private sector, there are, anyway, we've identified like 7 incentives why some corporations are actually doing this, and starts from, of course, reputation, because, and of course it could actually also undermine reputation, so you need to be sensitive about how you go about that. From reputation to ultimately getting better research about their data. Many telecom operators are opening the data just to get better insight actually about what the data can tell them and how they establish new models. 2, for instance, in the context of Facebook, retainment of talent. Because what Facebook does is they don't really share any data. They really engage around the questions, and then their data scientists work with the public sector or with the research community on actually extracting insight. And so it turns out that if they establish those relationships, their staff, their data scientists, are more likely to stay at Facebook because they can now also work on public problems beyond optimizing advertising on a daily basis. And so that's in itself a human relations incentive to then actually engage their data scientists with, for instance, World Bank or UNICEF or any other kind of thing. And again, we have to be sensitive about, is this the real incentive you want to unlock? But at least there are a variety of incentives that exist to actually start collaborating around the data beyond, of course, the incentive of doing good in society, which is then, anyway, I've written about that, the new social responsibility of corporations in the data age.
Thank you.
I don't know whether that's an answer.
We can discuss more at the end. So before further ado, Alex, the floor is yours.
Sorry. With the permission of the moderator, I've been given 1 minute to thank you for inviting me continually since we met in 2012 and the other meeting we had. Truly, this is an amazing event, and I'm excited because we're in the middle of developing data protection laws, so all the resources I can get from the speakers, they're really timely and useful. So thank you so much for this symposium full of experts who are academically stimulating. And I also want to say there are students who are here, so we also have a bit of a disconnect. We have experts who know these subjects to the end, depth and breadth. And then yesterday during the coffee break, two of your students came to me and told me, let me be honest, these things are so difficult, I don't understand anything they are saying. And I assured them, take heart. For when I was in first year at my university, I looked at my lecturer and everything he was saying was jaw-dropping. For the entire lecture session, I was just staring at him. I said, my God, what an intelligent person. I've understood not a single word of what he said. But by the time I finished my course, I'd had a few inspiring things. So take heart. You'll get to know from us and from the other experts. I think this is absolutely amazing. I'm also learning a lot. So there is... my organization focuses, Code IP Trust focuses on technology and how it influences culture and how culture influences technology. We are not, Stefan, I'm pleased to announce, we are not technology refuseniks. We actually embrace and love technology for the potential of prosperity and development it can do. But we like exposing the ugly underbelly of technology so that it can be fixed to serve humanity better. So, I also took note of what Ashley said about how legislators love making new laws. This is a global phenomenon that has happened. We are witnessing it firsthand with the new introduction of the two houses, where you are having one house making laws, the other one making other laws, and sometimes conflicting, sometimes duplicating. And I want to pose a question before I even go into my speech. What happens if everything we do in life is subject to a certain law? Everything we do, probably even breathing, even walking, there's a new law on walking. Everything we are going to do, it's not like the common law where there are certain principles that you either violated them and then you'd have a problem. Now you can imagine the kind of life we would have. And so they say, I think in one country, no need to mention it, that if you follow a motorist for 1,000 kilometers, you're surely going to find them breaking the law. Every driver knows in this room and anywhere in the world that at one point or other they have broken the law. So if you tie that with data since you were born, somebody holding it since the day you were born, then you can see why I'm driving. That since you were born, you have broken a law, or anyway, you'll break a future law if you haven't done it already. So there's the importance of the evolution of society and how we relate with law that we need to worry about this. So let me go now into my presentation and take my 10, 12 minutes. Thank you. Why did I pick this topic? It's because, like those students were asking yesterday, they're experts and they're generalists. And in 2007 at Rio, when I was at the second IGF, somebody told me that technical people tend to fall into two categories, specialists and generalists. The specialists learn more and more about a narrower and narrower field until he eventually, in the limit, knows everything about nothing. The generalist learns less and less about a wider and wider field until eventually he knows nothing about everything. So we tend to oscillate between generalists and specialists, and in each of the themes and the topics, we have this wide spectrum of play that we could do. So what do I then want to achieve with my presentation about how culture, and in our protocol, I mean culture in the sense of human relations, because where I come from, sometimes people mistake culture with tradition and heritage, but culture simply in terms of how human beings relate at different stratas, from family, with children, from neighbors, old, young, teacher, student, business, and on the street. This is the culture I talk about, and how we all relate with each other, and how is technology and the innovations, and of course in this case privacy in that realm, how is it interfered with? So what do I want to achieve? I want to achieve the following after my 10 minutes presentation. One, I want us to consolidate these aggregated impacts on different aspects, or at least provoke some thought on that, to look at it in terms of a human development in the wake of the technologies. Then I want to demonstrate also that innovation in itself requires, as a prerequisite, space for privacy. It requires quiet reflection, and of course it needs to be safe, and it also needs to protect the output of that. without which creativity suffers and innovation therefore cannot take place. I want to posit that I want the audience, to provoke the audience to reflect on how this has influenced them or impacted them in their own lives, interpersonal relationships, and the people around them. And maybe I hope also to inspire or maybe call for further research into this area, because I don't find a lot of literature on the same. Right, why does this subject matter? Maybe as a way of creating a locus into discussing this, or for somebody to feel it's justified to discuss it. One is that the network of centers, which is what the courtesy of what we are here, was started to study internet and society. So in other words, the impact of internet and society in its broad sense. So we want us maybe to review the socio-cultural evolution due to the internet, and then interrogate some of these arguments for and against impact of the internet, privacy on culture, and how it has happened. Maybe demystify some of the common myths about technology and some of the misrepresentation that we are given. I want also to look at the evidence, some bit of evidence to quantify the claim that there are cost implications into some of these use. Maybe can I have tangible figures about the costs of this use of these technologies, cost to us and society in general. I want also to propose some interventions, and I will conclude finally with an example which I borrowed from Turkey. In 2015, I've implemented it, and I think it's an example of some of the practical interventions that we could all take in our different ways to improve the situation other than just complaining about it. So here we go. Let's look at the cultural evolution prior to the internet. What has happened if we take a historical view of it? What used to happen in the medieval ages, in the Middle Ages? We had a certain hierarchy from kings right at the top, vassals, knights, all the way going down to the priests, monks, nuns, serfs, until right at the bottom there were the servants who were serving the people, above them. Now, in the internet social hierarchy, what do we have? Pre-internet, before the internet became common in our lives, and that should be prior to 1990, because I think 90 is when it became a public, open, accessible to the public. We had heads of states. We had maybe governors or representatives of regions, provincial, security. We had local chiefs, community leaders, and citizens, and we had the postal and maybe the telephone system to have communication, which then changed. In the internet age, I do not know, in fact I've put question marks, who we can say, who commands power at the top? I really don't know. Maybe you have the answer. Who commands control? Who is the person at the top? Who commands the money, the resources in this economy? Now, who is the king or queen for that matter? And then there is a key word that I've been seeing people using, because it's one of the things is to question some of these nomenclature, this naming of things like data subjects. Why are we subjects? Okay? Who are the masters? We are data subjects. We are being continually encouraged to think of ourselves as the subjects. There are people who talk of the last mile technology. We like looking at it at the first mile because that's where we are. Bottom of the pyramid. We like looking at it at the foundation of the pyramid. The name is everything. It defines who we are. It gives you our pride. It gives us our standing in terms of the power relations with the people we are going to discuss with. We need to look at this age, why we are data subjects. Who are the data masters? Who are the data kings? Key question. Then we look at maybe how this innovation has been brought about, because let's look at some of the things that human beings like doing. Today, if you can hire somebody to do a certain task for you, drive you around, it's a lesser task than you to commit. If you can hire somebody as a student to write your paper, they are doing it nowadays, and then you can have all the nice time at college, pay them a little money, and then you hand it in as if it's your own. If you can hire somebody to guard your home, and then you can have better sleep. If you can, all routine tasks that you feel are lower than you, and then somebody can do it. What has technology done to us from that pre-internet age to now? has it come in and told us if we want a date, we swipe left? If we are having problems with loneliness, swipe right. And then we have somebody who understands us in our own bubble and really wants to keep us in that space because we should not move out of that. And then we are confined. We don't explore our environment. The technology has made us so comfortable in who we are, with the friends we are, that we walk around with only the few we know. We never meet new people. And even when you meet real people, you are so afraid of these real people that you want to stick to the virtual ones. Never mind whether you're talking to robots or AI. And speaking of robots, we have even replaced human relationship, even love, with Samantha. And surely, what kind of a life are we leading in terms of our relations with technology? A robot that can be seduced, and what point is it if the answers can always be programmed? That's the question. Now, how are these dynamics playing out, privacy dynamics, in this internet age, the data age? You see, the first thing we have to look at is that nobody is asking us for all this data. Even if you're talking about protecting it, the system, the plan, the model is we hand in our data, very willingly. We are more too happy because there are certain conditions as human beings we always crave for. We crave for fame, we crave for love, attention, fame. We want to be successful, we want to be liked, and some kids actually are getting depressed if they post a new photo and they're not getting as many likes and they feel it's terrible. So we are handing in all this information, and when we are looking for a job, we willingly, more than willingly, give in all the information required because it's a condition. That includes our educational information, including health. Sometimes it's required. And then we create then a master-subject relationship with the people we are giving the data, regardless of the platform. Then there's corporate data consolidation as the next stage. This is converted into a computer server. Sysadmin has access to all employees' data. So for those of you that didn't know, the system administration in the institutions, wherever you are from, is a very powerful person. Probably next to the CEO, that's the other person who has most information about everyone. They can decide what emails you won't get and what you'll get. They know what the sites you visit. They have a lot of power over you, so the power relations again start playing there. Then what happens is the service provider connecting your company now collects from many more people. We can see the layer, the bulk, the storage of data increasing. Somebody's having more and more and more. The agents collecting bit and bit. Mobile operator then has for the whole country. Then when you combine mobile operators and the internet service providers, they have double the information that they need. And then what happens is that collectively, these people are controlling voluminous amounts of data. All that consolidated, then they engage DPI, deep privacy intrusion, or data. And then what happens with this? When you realize your information is held by all those people, you are afraid. You become enfeebled as a person. You adopt conformity. You cease challenging what is happening in society. You lose creativity. You stop innovating. You yield to servitude. So we are progressively becoming servants, and we are not producing new things. So then what happens is that we get artificial intelligence coming in, and then that not only makes us, not only weakens us further, but it takes away our ability to innovate. I want to conclude because I have, I think, only 1 minute left. I could say more on this, but I want to conclude and say, if you look at the, excuse the mind map jumping all over. Excuse me. Let me demystify a few terms, and then I end it there. One of them is we talk about, I want to pose a question. Is there a conspiracy to brand only technology with acceptable names and brands? Is it time that probably society started looking at the harmful side effects of technology, of the internet, something I covered in 2011 as an article? We have to understand what is intelligence before we can adopt artificial intelligence. What is intelligence before artificial intelligence can qualify? What is learning and what is involved in learning before we can say a computer can learn? What cognitive senses are involved in learning before we can even claim that a computer can learn? When we talk of cloud computing, When have you ever had an aircraft pilot saying, ladies and gentlemen, we got to steer off a cloud of servers because they're in the cloud? We have to know some of these don't exist. They're just invented just to ensure that we are confused and we conform to that. My time is up, according to my watch. I would like to wrap up by just saying, giving that example. There are many things we could say about this, but most of all I want to caution, because there are people here involved in law, that when we are looking at laws, among the things we need to worry about is we have to look at laws that whose objective, stated objective, is to protect the individual, but on the contrary, they worsen, they either sanitize the situation and worsen the standing of the person. Now, on artificial, do they create artificial privacy and trust, whereas they are establishing platforms where we can continue, the reservoirs of our data can be created, the clauses therein are actually enabling that, but they cover, and they're very good at naming acts in a very positive way, but Cloud Act, but when you go inside, certain clauses are doing the exact opposite. The other one, sections...
Alex, I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you like to continue on the Q&A session?
On the?
Q&A session?
Yes, I will
because
continue.
We pass our time.
12 minutes, okay.
Thank you very much.
And I think with that, let me pause there. Thank you very much for listening.
So thank you. I'm sorry, but we ran out of time for direct questions to Alex. So let me quickly invite Alexandra to the floor. Thank you.
Hi. So today I'm going to speak of a very specific, way more concrete subject on the blockchain, new technologies, and how they are compatible or not with the GDPR. We're going to focus just on definitions today. First of all, what is a blockchain? There is no agreed upon universal definition, so I'm going to just describe its main functions. It's an append-only database that connects a distributed network of nodes through various cryptographic methods, and those nodes, those participants of the network, coordinate using consensus technologies that have been developed. So these technologies that constitute the blockchain are not new. They're just a combination of pre-existing technologies. And even the idea that represents, that the blockchain represents is not new. We're talking about the ideas of decentralization that have been around forever since the beginning of the internet. Well, we had the dream of decentralization that, well, we all know how that went down. And then we had commons networks, commons-based peer production, and now we have the blockchain that has promises of giving disruptive potential to various societal problems. Yes. So ideally, the blockchain technology and the GDPR have some high-level common goals. So the blockchain is presented as a new way that can be used to control our data, to store and manage our data in a secure manner, because if essentially it looks to solve the problem of distrust on intermediaries or in other high-level actors in data control. And also the GDPR basically has the same goal of maximizing the control that users have over their data. However, the difference is in the perception of how we're going to achieve that control. Blockchain is a priori decentralized technology, and the GDPR has been conceived for a more centralized architecture where specific actors are designated and can be held liable. Besides that conceptual, well, compatibility, there are also those incompatibilities stemming from the absence of central actors, but not only that. even before going to talk about actor liability, the problem that we face is on definitions. What is protected on the database and what is protected on the blockchain, which data should be covered by the GDPR or not. So what sort of data do we store on the blockchain? Well, first of all, we have plain text data. We have those are simple numbers or describing the metadata describing some transactions, and those transactions involve metadata, encrypted personal data, and hashed personal data. Basically, to give it very simply, this transactional data would describe who gave what to whom, right? And so that would be in an encrypted method or in a hashed method. What does the law say? We all know that it's only anonymous data that do not fall under the GDPR, and so pseudonymous data are personal data subject to the GDPR. The differences between the two, according also to the Article 29 Working Party and the GDPR, in the anonymous data that should make it impossible to identify a natural person, a data subject, but pseudonymous data can, given enough information, can lead to the re-identification of a natural person, of the data subject. So what does that mean for the blockchain data? Well, this is not new. Hashing and asymmetric cryptography have been around for a while, so I think the Article 29 Working Party has given some suggestions about what is and what isn't anonymous data, and it has definitely said that hashing and public keys involved in asymmetric cryptography that should be on the blockchain, that they are not anonymization methods. They are, even if sometimes it is very hard to actually lead to the re-identification, it is still considered possible to re-identify a natural person, so they are pseudonymous data. So what does that mean for the blockchain data? How do we go beyond that trouble? Because that means that essentially the main functions, the main information that we should and we have to store on the blockchain are protected under the GDPR. So two elements are key elements to identifying how we can work around those issues. First of all is to see understand which of these pseudonymous data are essential to the functioning of the blockchain, and also the fact that this database stays forever and it just keeps on adding data. So these are essential functions in order to be able to interpret how personal data can be actually protected with the GDPR. There are a lot of solutions that have been proposed on this problem, which is a problem that has been around also for a while. Because the communities that are involved in building blockchains, the technical communities, are also very privacy aware, and they are trying to protect their privacy. And there has been also a lot of research from technical researchers showing that given enough information, the public keys can lead to identification of the users of the blockchain. One main solution that is also very technical, a technicality that is being used a lot, is that take most of your data off chain. So you just store everything that is very, very essential to that. But still that leaves us with the problem, well, what do we do with the hashes? Because even if we take all the data out of the blockchain, the essential hashing mechanism that connects the blocks together still needs to be there. Otherwise, we do not have a blockchain. So what do we do with this data that are essential to it? There are a lot of privacy-enhancing technologies that are being used right now and are being tested. Lots of them. However, there's no standardization. For example, one of the most famous ones is a zero-knowledge proof that that permits the verification of the information without actually disclosing it. And however, because there is no standardization, there is no way of actually accepting that this specific technology would lead to anonymization, and so to have it legally recognized as a standard that would lead to anonymized data. And to go even further, even if we would need to standardize some of the technology that we have a commonly accepted list of technologies that lead to anonymization of this data, this list should have to continuously be updated because of this aspect of the blockchain that keeps the data forever. Yes, so legal solutions to this issue of how can we enforce the rights that the GDPR describes for personal data is to take into account the interpretations of those data. For example, the fact that some of the data are essential to the function of the blockchain, and so the way that we're going to enforce the data would be limited to also to the technologies, the technology that is at stake. And also that combined with obviously accepting that some of these privacy-enhancing technologies would suffice to build this privacy by design mechanism. However, how would those standards be adapted to the blockchain is also something that could create issues with regards to the already existing data from the existing blockchains, because even if there is no question that eventually we can actually build from scratch a blockchain that is GDPR compliant, the question remains for the existing ones because they're not going to go away. And there is already, for example, taking the most famous blockchains of Ethereum Foundation or even the Bitcoin cryptocurrency database, they are not going to go away. So how do we make those compliant with the GDPR is the most burning question, and not whether we're going to build one that is going to be GDPR compliant. So to go back to this, to the consequences of how we combine technical and legal solutions is that whether and if we accept that there are some technological standards for anonymization, what does that mean for the users? Can they actually turn to the developers of this decentralized database, or the actors that are responsible for building, for making the technological decisions of the specific database, and on the grounds of data minimization, of privacy by design, hold them liable for not choosing a different technology that would be more privacy appropriate? And how would that mean, how would they enforce those rights for example, because the data is stored forever in the blockchain, if some anonymous data managed to be identifiable using technological advancements, then what would that mean for those personal data? How would we be able to re-accommodate them and making them GDPR compliant? So these are all, that was, well, an overview of the problems between the blockchain and the GDPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. If you'd like to take a seat, let's start the Q&A session with the floor. How much time do we have for the rest of the session? So it's already over. Okay, so we are the ones between you and the lunch. So let's take one question from that gentleman, and with the lady we will ask, we're going to reply them offline if that's okay with you.
Hi, I'm Güneş Aksever, I'm an attorney. And my question is for Salome and Stefan. And sorry for addressing you on a first name basis. I don't want to ruin your surname. So the body of discussions on stage and off stage for the past 2 days on emerging tech and privacy matters remind me a lot of the anxiety behind distribution of power in the early days of internet, especially during the early 90s. And so how do you see the applicability of multi-stakeholder governance approaches to the current matters at hand? I don't really see much difference between the first days of the internet and now, which is both uncharted territory and which is both mainly driven by technology enthusiasts and engineers. Thank you.
Do you want to start? It's on. So if I understand your question, you're sort of wondering, is there a multi-stakeholder sort of approach here? And are we sort of just grappling with the same problems we had at the beginning of the internet? Is that correct? Well, I think in the context of Internet of Things, we're sort of experiencing the result of certain blind spots with an essentially decentralized approach that we had the first time around on the internet, where there was a strong push to support innovation while at the same time ensuring free access. And you sort of have as a result incredible concentrations of power. And so I sort of see a multi-stakeholder approach maybe being helpful in helping to think about how we can disaggregate that power in a graceful way while maintaining a lot of the promise of technologies. But, and you know, I think in the IoT context, in the deep interconnectedness of these sensing networks, you have to have a multi-stakeholder approach to deal with, at the same time, the privacy challenges, the security challenges, and alternative viable business models. Yeah, so I completely agree. I mean, you have to have a multi-stakeholder approach. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure. So very interesting question, and I always feel guilty because the whole concept of multi-stakeholdership was in my former life is one that we introduced at the and exactly in the context of the G8 at a certain point in time. There was a focus on digital opportunity task force, and we developed the concept of multi-stakeholdership as it applies to the internet. And since then, the UN took it over, and then everyone else, and ICANN, of course, anyway, believes that they are multi-stakeholder as well. And unfortunately, the ICANN person is not here, so have a discussion perhaps. But my big lesson of so many years of practice of multi-stakeholdership is that we have to become more sophisticated to know when do we need what parties at what stage of the policy making to really make this work. Because the assumption of multi-stakeholdership is that every party has to be present at every stage of decision making and consideration to be seen as legitimate. And I think that's a totally flawed concept, which makes multi-stakeholdership quite often ineffective, a talk shop, and not without any meaningful output. And so we really have to deconstruct the process, which means that who needs to be at the table or who needs to be consulted, because quite often it doesn't have to be at the table, which is my other frustration with, by the way, internet policy making, which is that internet policy making is almost like policy making in the 20th century without actually using the internet, right? So it's like astounding. They're making policy about the internet, but they forget that they actually can use the tools to also change the way they go about making policy making. And so if you deconstruct who needs to be at the agenda setting stage, who needs to be at the problem definition stage to make this more legitimate, how do you then ideate about the best solutions? And quite often those are not the people that actually are the ones that are currently part of the equation of multi-stakeholdership. Who needs to be at the table to make this for actually implementing it? Who needs to be at the stage to actually review whether it all works and then suggest changes? If we have a more deconstructed approach and then really trying to understand on how do we be more inclusive but also more effective, That would be my argumentation, and happy to work with you on doing this because the current system of multi-stakeholdership fails to actually go into that direction and still has this old 20th century where we actually have to fly in everyone and then assume that everyone actually has something to add.
Yeah, I have a legal problem with multi-stakeholder. What would be a legal definition of a multi-stakeholder if you are to define it in a court of law? It becomes troublesome. That is on the legal side. Number two, if we use this symposium as an example, and we ask about the multi-stakeholders that have been here and their contribution and their thoughts and their concerns, how many of them got reflected? How many people had a chance to speak on the microphone? Now you find, normally it's been found that whereas you have multi-stakeholder consultative forums, it's usually the same opinions, point of view that tend to be given from the high table to the audience. So what is the solution to this? One of the solutions is an initiative I've been part of, CDD at stanford.edu, Center for Deliberative Democracy, where Professor Fishkin started this initiative where every participant gets involved prior to participating to the say symposium, a brief, and then they get involved. You find they contribute more, and then after that, they go back to their groups and deliberate on the issues that are there. And it was found that the views of more people are accommodated other than just the experts. And I think that is one of the ways of resolving that issue of amorphous multi-stakeholders, which nobody can really define or have a legal name behind it. But thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess now it's time for three things. First, take the rest of the discussion off the stage. Second, during lunch, as soon as we finish, thanking our all distinguished speakers. Thank you, guys.